And we're off. Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown. I am Kieran, the Quarrelsome O'Regan, and I am joined by
James Vitus. No cool epithet, unfortunately.
Not yet. But so basically, without being too lighthearted about it, there's in case people haven't noticed, there's some crack going on in the US and across the West at large, even to the extent where even I was walking around Cork since early June. There's been Black Lives Matter and George Floyd graffiti actually all over Cork. I must send you across the photos, even here in Ireland.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it. Oh.
Yeah, but basically the theme of the episode today, from what myself and James have been talking about and things that we've been encountering in the media, is basically going to be based around trying to put a finger on what might be happening to cause such what seems to be like mass hysteria around things like police violence, etc. And there's this kind of surface story. So and in short, if you want to get a more detailed breakdown of the way we think about this, I think it was episode 6 is called the OG false dichotomy. And we go in it's basically a full conversation going through the way that we basically think about this topic. And in short, neither of us, like if I speak for myself and maybe James as well, he can correct me, but we're both, given the name of the episode, at the end of the show, we're both aware of our own infinite ignorance, and we're both willing to change our mind in light of evidence around the existence of a disproportionate use of lethal violence against Black people in the US by police. And disproportionate in terms of, we go detail in the previous episode, not in terms of per 100,000, but in terms of interactions with police officers, etc., because of engagements in violent crime and the worst and all that kind of stuff. So we go in detail in that episode. And so basically there's this reality in the situation where, of the way things are currently looking, where there's a very simple reality, which is along the lines of using just last year's data as an example to illustrate a very quick point. Last year there were 14 unarmed Black people killed by police in the US, out of 1,000 people killed in total. But in Chicago alone, there were 358 Black people murdered, and in the US last year. And in Chicago alone this year, over the July 4th weekend, I'm pretty sure there was 104 Black people killed. There were 104 people killed. They were most, if not all, Black. And in 2018, 12.6% of the population are Black, but 53.3% of murder and non-negligent manslaughter in the whole country was done by Black people, and 43.3% of weapons offences were done by Black people. And as far as I know, the data pretty much shows that it's about 7 times more likely for a Black person to kill a Black person than a white person to kill a white person. So Black on Black murder is 7 times more likely than white on white murder. So given that data, just as a very surface level, what's I suppose frustrating myself and James is the kind of the fact that there's this, what we see as there's all this energy, but it's been, and wherever the source, you might talk about maybe actual potential source of it or whatever down the line, but a lot of this energy is being driven by people's opinions about the world that we think are, based on the data, are apparently unjustified. So their opinions about the reality of the situation in the US as it relates to police violence is apparently unjustified, given the data. And of course, we're willing to change our mind. So basically, in short, what we're looking to discuss is the reason I mentioned the stats around the US and the violence and Black on Black murder, etc., and the deaths is because of organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement that are just this seemingly ridiculous, because they're hyper focused on lethal police violence against unarmed Black people, but are then choosing to just, why is there not a proportionate amount, not that stuff doesn't need to be addressed, but why is there not a proportionate amount of energy being put towards just the amount of black people that are losing their lives to murder at large in the US, or the amount of people that are partaking in murder and hence ending up in prison and everything as a result. So, like, if black lives really matter to this organization, would they not be focused on putting their energy where it would be needed the most, and not simply where allows them to garner the most amount of attention, which are the single cases that end up on video of black people ending up at the receiving end of police violence? That, you know, so again, there's that Stalin quote that one death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is statistics, that I can't help but think of. So with that, basically, what we're going to try and have a hash out is a discussion on what is it that's causing this mass hysteria, given the fact that the data doesn't support the surface level argument, which is around police violence and disproportionate use against black people lethally. And also the fact that there's massive problems in America in relation to violence at large that aren't being addressed because the attention has been put on this area that doesn't seem to have any justification. So with that, I'll hand it over to James to see what your initial thoughts are and if you have anything to add or where to kick us off.
Yeah, man. The thing is, I'm looking at the same thing, and I'm seeing a situation in which actually, since the beginning of all of this, I don't want to say that I'm happy to say that one positive side effect of this this ideologically flawed movement is that I have turned my attention more towards what's going on with police, and where actually the police could do with some reforms. And I think there's definitely a truth there, in as much as there are some really stupid things that the police are doing that just seem like they're resulting in situations in which it's almost inevitable somebody's going to get seriously hurt. No, not great is the obvious one. And when you draw attention to that, that's a good thing. The problem is when you draw attention to that based on a lie, now you're going to misdiagnose problems, and it's very hard to treat a misdiagnosis. If you assume that a tumor is there because of benign reasons, you're going to treat it differently than, or reverse that. If you think it's there for malignant reasons, you're going to treat that tumor in a way that actually probably destroys the healthy organism unnecessarily if it was benign. I think I'm just trying to think through. I'm trying to think through what's generating this misunderstanding of the situation. And we've talked about a few things. I think it maybe be helpful to drill into some of them, because you've got multiple factors at play. Social desirability bias, which is generating sort of this falsified preference or falsified belief of, oh yeah, no, I'm totally behind this, which is definitely true of some people. Like, some people are just lying about the fact that they've even thought 2 seconds about the complexity of the issues we're discussing here, the complexity of a society wherein you have police with guns and you have a really heavily armed population. And how is it that you're ever going to expect there not to be some people who get killed unnecessarily? So people haven't wrestled with that. They're just saying things due to their social desirability bias. They're misportraying what they actually think just so that the other person thinks better of them. You've got the availability bias, which I really think deserves some time, because I think that is what perpetuates so much of the myth around this. Because when I'm talking to my nan and my nan's telling me, oh man, the police over there are awful, it's like, why would my nan think that? It's because of these availability entrepreneurs that are that are monopolizing on the attention and outrage that is generated by certain imagery, even if this imagery is not representative of the reality. You've got negativity bias, wherein people obviously are most attuned to what's going wrong and they're out of step with the positives. And that is also feeds into the availability bias. So when the news report, hey, things are worse now, like, so things can get better and better, and then they'll have a drop, and then the news will go, things are worse than they were, and then they'll be silent, it will silently improve again, and then have a small drop, and then the news will report things are worse than they, and it's like that. And so you have multiple points along the chart at which all you hear from the news are things are worse, things are worse, things are worse. And actually,
the trend is upward.
Yeah, the trend is massively upwards. So that's the negativity bias feeding into the availability bias. You've got the confirmation bias, where I listened to Breonna Taylor's story, and I'm outraged of what happened. Like I read this amazing article in the New York Times where what's her name, Rukmani, she does some really incredible investigative journalism into what happened to Breonna Taylor, how this event transpired. And I'm like there feeling the outrage. You see in these protesters, yeah. You see how angry they are. I actually read this article and I'm feeling it. I read that, you know, one of the officers gets shot in their femoral artery in their leg and they're bleeding out. And I'm actually thinking, frickin' die, pig. Like, I can't believe, but I'm meta aware of the fact that this outrage is a useless way of gauging the truth of the situation. Yeah. But I'm experiencing it, so I can actually, it's good in regard to empathizing. I come to the end of that and I think, no, not grades are a travesty. The fact that the police didn't do far more to ensure that the environment in which they were about to walk was worth all of the hassle it's about to bring, it is absolutely, you know, inexcusable. But I don't then come out of that and somehow decide, and you know what as well, I know for a fact that this is because of Breonna's phenotypical traits. This is because of her skin color. Nowhere in that story is it even hinted at that this had anything to do with the fact that she was a person of a certain ethnicity. And I read it and I feel all the outrage, but somehow other people read that and it's the confirmation bias of, and then that basically confirms to them that the police are racist, rather than there's some serious systemic problems that are affecting everybody. No, not grades are awful when they happen to anybody of any background, and they do. They happen to more people who aren't black than are identified as black. So you've got that, and so you've got all these multiple factors that sort of feed into what we're seeing. And I think it's, you know, it's worth exploring them a bit more. But I suppose I've spoken for a long time, but that's sort of where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, no, man. Oh, yeah. A few points on just what you elaborated on, or to build on what you said. So firstly, you mentioned about the police reform needed in the US itself. And I don't know if I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I've tried it to you about it, but nothing on the podcast, where I've lived in the US 4 separate occasions. I've traveled through 38 of the lower 48 states. I've had guns pulled on me 3 times by cops. And one of those involved me getting smashed into the window of a real estate agent's and having a gun pulled on me.
I have to admit, dude, when you're saying this, I'm like, what were you doing though, Kieran? The police were that interested in you.
I know, man. There are stories for another day, like, but they were all pretty much, they were all like harmless situations. 2 of them were ridiculous. One of them was really ridiculous. One of them was just a cop, I don't know, trying to be overzealous and put a fright on us. You know, we're having a party at a beach and he just appeared. Anyway, but then the third one then was just absurd. I thought I was going to get tasered, so I actually started laughing because I was like, I'm going to get. I thought, but then it was afterwards. My buddy had said, "Man, that wasn't a fucking taser he pulled out at all. It was his gun, man." You know. So
anyway, my God, dude.
So, yeah. So and then also, so that's the first one. So you mentioned about the need for reform. Like, to me, this defund the police stuff is utterly insane. Like, it's beyond bananas. It's an unbelievably naive, utterly stupid suggestion. It's like, if you want to make things better, let's give it less money. Let's give it less. Let's put less resources towards something, and it's going to improve magically.
Can I just quickly make a? I just want to make a insight on that, because it was something that occurred to me a few days ago. You know how ideas are thought to be dangerous at the moment, like, you know, certain ideas can be dangerous. I thought that's so hypocritical when one of the ideas that's being perpetuated by these same people who think that ideas can be dangerous is one of the most dangerous ideas that's imaginable, which is to say abolish the police. And if we made the same claims that their ideas are dangerous so they shouldn't be allowed to have them, then we would be stopping their protests, because that is a really dangerous idea. But we don't make that, we don't flip the argument and say, and use that as an excuse they can't say it. We just argue with the point, but they don't want to have, anyway. That occurred to me, is like that's so hypocritical.
But that's it. It's like, but again, that's a different point, and we can maybe get onto that in a bit. But this ideology doesn't prioritize reason and logic and civil discourse as a means of orientating towards any truer understanding of reality, because lived experience is what matters to them. They denigrate claims to objective knowledge. So anyway, we can get onto that later on. But like, so there's that thing right around so to me, as a short on the police, it's like, how about pay them really well and train them like fucking Navy SEALs, and have retired Jockos and Tim Kennedys be like police coaches that teach them on armed restraint and how to be able to actually navigate armed conflict and unarmed conflict in really efficient ways, and to be able to cope under duress. And then that to me is a solution, is how about pay them better and train them really well. And the reason for that is, if you mentioned the second point that I want to make around something else that you mentioned just after that, was around the armed population. So like, I had a mate when I was living in America who was like a minority, right? To use it fucking like just non-white or whatever, right? Just because it matters apparently. But he was like, I had a load of mates that had illegally held weapons. You know, I lived in Massachusetts and had really strict gun laws. I had a load of mates that had illegally held firearms. And I had one mate, this is an example of how armed the population is. I had one mate who wasn't involved in any gangs or crimes or anything. He just liked guns, and he liked just going out with his mates and shooting targets and stuff, you know. And this is only some of the guns he had. He had a semi-automatic, like magazine-loaded shotgun, right? And he had what I think may have been an M4, like automatic rifle, not the AR-15, civilian version, the semi-automatic one. And then he had a few handguns. But the funniest thing he had was a handful of fragmentation grenades. You know?
What are you ever going to do with a grenade? Like, target practice is one thing, but target practice with grenades.
I was like, what are we doing here, man? Like, so like, and he just thought it was funny, and he just like bought it off some lad who got it. You know, it was like, man. Like, what are we? And he just felt I was a really good dude, sound fella. And I was like, all right, man, like, this is, what the fuck are we doing? I found it hilarious. I was like, well, what are we? What's anyway? So that's an example of how armed the populace are. Is like, so there's that. So like, you think that as a situation at the police, and then you think about how difficult their job is. And you're like, well, the solution isn't to get rid of them, because they're just the vacuum will be filled either by anarchy or violent vigilante mobs.
Yeah, the argument is, just to quickly do some justice to the argument, is the police are being involved in mental health issues where perhaps it would be better addressed by somebody trained to deal with mentally ill individuals. What you fail to understand when you say that is, many police turn up to the home of a mentally ill individual, and the mentally ill individual is wielding a knife, and or another weapon, and for you to send somebody who isn't armed, like a therapist or a psychiatrist, to go deal with that individual because you think the police should have no involvement. You're basically you're often going to be sending people to their death, because sometimes mentally ill people can be very dangerous, and that's why you send the police. So it's never as simple as people make it out to be.
And it's not as simple as because there are a lot of people who are claiming that defund the police means take money off the police and put it towards mental health services.
Yeah.
And then there's that rhetoric is talked about in a Mott and Bailey strategy perspective by those who actually want to abolish the police, where to them defund the police means literally get rid of it. So like, the same phrase, defund the police, it's just face sounds or it's words on a fucking placard. But to some people it means they're going with this. There is a massive mental health issue in America. Like I've lived in San Francisco where there's thousands of people living on the street. I've lived, and it's the worst homeless crisis I've ever seen, like in the Western world, like, and in that city of San Francisco for particular reasons. But and Seattle as well, like living underneath bridges, people living in tents by the thousands around the city, and the stuff I've seen over there. But anyway, so like, and this is just anecdotal, not to mind the actual data and the suicide and depression, all this stuff. But like, there's this argument, there's a lack of willingness to focus on the detail and the nuance, because you even had the New York Times were producing podcasts that I've listened to. I had to just stop. They were talking about, well, what does a society look like that doesn't have a police force and this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Back in, you know, and it's like, well, what are we doing here? But anyway, so that's that kind of idea. That we're gonna off topic a little bit because we kind of made the point we want.
Yeah, we need to refocus.
Yeah. We need to kind of rein it back in. So, with regards to the availability bias, two things jump out there. One is what you mentioned about the media being what if it bleeds, it leads, essentially being that topic, but basically what bleeds is what for that particular bias, the bias that particular outlet has, them basically finding things that suit the bias that will get them clicks and views and everything and shares from their audience, and then also fitting the bias to fitting the narrative of the situation using like a narrative fallacy to the bias of the audience. So an example would be what we were discussing pre-recording was the CNN video on fiery but mostly peaceful protests, where there's this CNN reporter in Kenosha, the whole background is on fire. Cars, buildings, everything on fire. And then the headline underneath him is fiery but mostly peaceful. And then his explanation over it is that it was really peaceful and everything during the day, but then it got out of hand. But then he said he was basically justifying it getting out of hand based on what he saw was an all too common occurrence of violence against black people, in referring to the Jacob Blake event that had happened the day before or whatever. So he was basically saying that the all too common occurrence of, it's like, all right, man, be specific. How common? Exactly how common are you talking about? And how common are you referring to this situation in comparison to people that are not black? Exactly. So that they're not willing to, they're just fitting with this narrative. There's this race baiting narrative without acknowledging the data, without acknowledging the detail in the situations, without acknowledging existence of cases like a Tony Timpa after George Floyd died and Tony Timpa died, and even what were even more massive, more sociopathic looking circumstances where the cops were laughing and everything. Like
it was an even more invidious example. I think we should actually note we're recording this on 9/11, and I saw a funny tweet. I forget who said it, but it's so applicable. It's like somebody said the flights on 9/11 were mostly peaceful. It's like that's a useless thing to say. Yeah. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, he was basically making fun of this. The protests are mostly peaceful. It's like, yeah, but those like parts that aren't peaceful, like, are really worth drilling in on. Like, you wouldn't just go, oh, don't worry about 9/11 because the flights on that day were mostly peaceful. Why would you focus in on the one that wasn't? It's like, because it's really important to do so.
Yeah, and And the fact that the media aren't, the fact there's just no, the standard, the legacy media they're just not telling the truth. No one is telling the truth. Like, they're just the standard media. It doesn't seem like any of these outlets are just actually acknowledging reality. And as a result, the polarization and this dehumanization of the other are just snowballing out of all control. Like, and so like, on top of that, then as well, this fits into the kind of narrative fallacy perspective and how negativity and confirmation bias all fit together with availability heuristic. But the availability heuristic, basically, in short, to build on what you said, if people think about, well, all we can do in formulating opinions about reality is to take into account what it is we've been exposed to and interpreted through our individually inherently flawed biased lens. So the information that we take in determines what actually pieces of information we have to formulate opinions about the world. And that's all being filtered through our lens. So if we're only encountering, I guess, a CNN or a New York Times or whatever, or outlets that are not acknowledging the data, not acknowledging the reality on the ground, are spinning things to justify riots, justify looting, like the NPR article that was just utter madness.
I know, it's a full book, In Defense of Looting. It's a full book that this lady wrote. And they did an interview of her. But the actual book itself it's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy, dude.
It's bananas. Like that NPR article, maybe we could put a link to it after this in the show notes, but if people want to give it a read and go, well, yeah, this is a lady's actual justification for looting and rioting. Or for looting. And so like there's this now, and even there was earlier on in when the CNN headquarters were being attacked by a very diverse crowd. But
CNN couldn't even muster the sort of the courage to stand up for themselves as they themselves were being broken into, as
their own place was getting wrecked, you know. And it was just those videos are insane. Like, what's going on? So anyway, so if people are taking in information from these news sources that are and their bias is to fit a particular narrative, then someone's own interpretation, when the things like NPR, New York Times, CNN are providing content like that, of course it's understandable as to why it is. And they're not talking about 104 people getting killed in Chicago on the weekend by other black people, pretty much. They're not talking about that. They're hyper focused in on these, what are basically like let's say the Jacob Blake thing, that's being used as a white swan. So this relates to what we discussed in prior, which is like from an availability heuristic, confirmation bias, negativity bias, all fitting together, would be something like every time, like, and Sam Harris talked about this in his podcast, Pulling Black from the Brink, where he's like, peace in the US can't be predicated on an unarmed black person never being killed by police again. Because there are 40 million black people in the US, and humans are flawed and we all make mistakes. And even if police were trained like Navy SEALs, and even if you could clone Jocko Willink and a load of his buddies and have them go out and train every police officer in the US, and if they all got 150 grand a year, and if they fail the fitness tests and they fail the aptitude tests, they're fired. And you end up with a team with every cop in the US is the best type of cop on earth, that's the most highly trained and the best paid. You've attracted the best people in society who mean the best. You're still going to have error and mistake, and human fallibility will still result in people dying that are unarmed and probably and possibly black. So we can't, even in best case scenario, we still have humans are involved, which makes us likely you're going to have error, and you're going to have poor decision making under pressure. You're going to have these things that result off the back of human fallibility and limitation. So basically, then you end up with that Jacob Blake gets shot, which has its own whole story behind it and reason. Like, there's a whole load of detail around that that's not acknowledged at all.
Yeah, he's supposedly a rapist, and she didn't even want him there.
Yeah, so. and they attempted to taser him twice, and they tried to arrest him peacefully. They tried to taser him twice, and then there was a knife found in his car, and even the fellow who filmed the video that showed it heard the cops telling him to drop the knife as he was leaning into the driver's seat of the car, and then according to the prosecutor in the place, who knows, all these details are going to emerge, but there's all this murky detail, and this stuff isn't acknowledged. And then you have Snoop Dogg. A buddy of mine sent me a screenshot of a Snoop Dogg post that had a cartoon of that young lad that killed those two people the night after, with the gun, walking past with his hand up, and then these two cops pointing guns at Jacob Blake in a cartoon. And then Snoop Dogg was basically like calling people out to it, like essentially civil war talk, saying, we've had enough, we're all we got, it's go time. You know, basically saying, like, as like a call to arms kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That's just like, what the fuck are we doing, man? Like,
yeah, there are a few things here. Like you were about to talk about falsifiability. I want to elaborate a little bit on availability bias. But let's let you introduce the white swan, black swan, because you were about to explain that. I think you got distracted by these stories. So explain how it is that, you know, Jacob Blake is a white swan, and how this feeds into falsifiability. So and then maybe I'll
Yes, no, in short, essentially, this is inspired by Karl Popper, where basically the best claims to knowledge that humans have are pieces of knowledge that we've tried to take sledgehammers to and have failed. So we've tried to find out where we're wrong and have thus far failed. And those are held up as, okay, these are the best reflections of reality we currently have, because of all these different cognitive biases that humans have around confirmation bias, tribal conformity, like you discussed earlier on, the fact that we prefer feeling right than finding out that we're wrong, the fact that we don't like or having our cultural or worldviews challenged, all these kind of things. We have all these inherent limitations. And what makes science so powerful is that science is a systematic way of asking us to find out where we're wrong, or at least a systematic way of finding out where each other are wrong, where there's an incentive structure there to bashing each other's ideas with sledgehammers. So this is where the idea of falsification comes in. So scientific knowledge doesn't grow via addition or accumulation of knowledge. Scientific knowledge about the workings of reality grows by generating a conjecture, which is just an opinion formed with incomplete knowledge. And because of the axiom of the infinite unknown, we only ever have incomplete knowledge. And you generate a conjecture, and then you try your hardest to refute that conjecture, and other people try to refute the conjecture. And if they can't, then that piece of information is held as transient truth for now until future evidence emerges to the contrary. So basically, that's essentially, so if I make the claim, this is a kind of a Karl Popper thing, but if I make the claim that all swans are white, one way of approaching that is by verification, where I just go around and take pictures of thousands of white swans. But the other way to approach that is to instead seek out non-white swans and to go, all right, where can I find swans that aren't white? And then the kind of the adage then is that there was actual black swans found in Australia. But basically that every time there's one of these violent cases against black people in the US, the specific case is taken as evidence to prove a point, in the absence of, rather than instead going prove a point around this lethal police violence and everything, rather than go, okay, this has happened, and this is a specific anecdotal situation that may, and the specific situation may very well have even had racism involved. But that doesn't mean that the overall claim is correct, because you can't anecdote. That's like an inductive reasoning. We can't draw general conclusions from specific examples. So in that sense, so instead the attempt is, well, where might we be wrong? So if you set out with the bias or the idea of, okay, there's this really crazy, disproportionate use of lethal violence against black people in the US. And then, okay, instead, if you take the mentality of verificationism, then I'm just going to seek out evidence to support that claim. Whereas the falsificationist viewpoint will be, okay, as a human, I have this idea. As a human, I am inherently flawed and fallible and limited and irrational. And I'm going to have a tendency toward favoring information that supports my viewpoint. So in order to combat that, I'm not going to seek out information that supports my bias. I'm going to try as hard as I can to find out where I'm wrong. And then you go, well, where might I be wrong? And then you go seeking out the big picture, the data, the existence of cases like a Tony Timpa, that is a guy who died in basically the exact same circumstances as George Floyd. And then you start seeking out all these other cases that exist. And it's a fundamentally different way of viewing reality and of viewing how we generate information about reality. One is the growth of understanding via negativa by chopping away dead wood. Two is the second way, that's science. That's falsificationism. The second way is verificationism, which is the via positiva accumulation of wood, whether it's rotting or not, to prove a point. So they're essentially, they're fundamentally opposite ways of viewing how it is how we determine opinions on, or create opinions on reality itself. So that's basically, to me, that's a one way of viewing what's going on at the moment, is a massive focus on verificationism at the expense of falsificationism.
Yeah.
Do you have any additions to that, or any?
No, I think I'm glad that we have that out there now, because that people need to understand what's been actually useful in driving progress and moving towards sort of uncovering more of the infinite expanse of ignorance. Like it's via negativa. It's sort of, trying to disprove what we already know. That's the fundamental principle of scientific method. I think all I want to do is, because we talk a lot about the availability heuristic, and it might not be clear to those who don't have a deep understanding of how it is that the mind takes certain information and overweights it and things. That if I just sort of explain a little bit, basically the concept is that you have these two modes of thinking. Daniel Kahneman calls them, Kahneman and Tversky called them System 1 and System 2. And System 1 effectively is this sort of intuition, almost automatic process. And the System 2 is the more conscious, deliberate thinking. What the availability heuristic does is it plays on the automatic thinking such that you're unknowingly substituting one question for another. And the question you think you're asking is, how many incidents like this happen, or how frequent is this, or how likely is this? And what you're actually substituting that question for is, how easily can I recall having seen things like this happen?
Yeah.
And that you don't realize that's happening, but because it's an automatic thinking process, that's the more available information. And that's always going to be more heavily weighted by the emotional. And because emotionality and the vividness of memory, it impacts the fluency of how you recall things. It impacts the availability of what there is to recall, and it impacts your judgments on the probability of outcomes. Cass Sunstein refers to the people who take advantage of this as availability entrepreneurs. I mentioned the phrase before. I just wanted to expand on that, because these people, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, these are availability entrepreneurs, and they are taking advantage of the bias by providing a continuous flow of the imagery that sort of sustains it. And what this results in is what Sunstein has also termed as an availability cascade. And that cascade is effectively how you go from this, and it transforms and manifests itself as policy that actually impacts society. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing genuine sort of recalls of police where they should be more prominent. But in Portland, I only need to say the word Portland, and then people can, if they don't know what I'm talking about, go and look at Portland and see what happens when you have a mayor who is subject and victim to the availability cascade, such that he is actually forming it is changing the way he manages his city because of these calls for certain things that are being influenced wholly by this availability bias, or maybe not wholly, but a lot by the availability bias, and it's causing probability neglect, which is I can't remember if that's Paul Slovic who came up with that, but basically just the neglect of the denominator. You know, you see a video and you care not for what this one instance is and what the denominator is. Like if it's 1/5, that's like, oh my God, a fifth chance. If it's 1/300 million, it's like, well, I'm not so worried. And that is in itself influenced by this availability bias, because like I said, it's the vividness of the recall. Do you think what I've said is clarified anything for the people who are watching? Because I'm trying to articulate it, but I realise that I keep getting caught up in certain.
No, but the system one fast. It never occurred to me that that's what's going on with the system one fast, and the fast thinking versus the slow thinking. Where I'd never. That's a brilliant point, because it never occurred to me that's actually it's like I've heard Daniel Schmachtenberger refer to the way the media is working, social media, and also the kind of legacy media that is dependent on advertising revenue, that it's essentially kind of like a limbic system hijack, that it's like a dependent on being able to hijack your emotive responses, which is system one thinking. And then system two thinking, to elaborate based on my kind of small understanding, is more like the deliberate critical analysis and interpretation of, like, from a kind of an attempt to separate out from the initial emotive response and to go, well, what's actually going on here, and how can I analyze my own opinion here? And it's like a more I don't know what you put it, like it's literally a slower way of thinking, but a way that allows us to try and counteract our innate limitations and biases. And a phrase there, like you mentioned, with Slovic, is like Slovic was the dude, if I'm correct, that did the research on, let's say, on people's willingness to support charities, wasn't it? And then that decreased the more people were perceived to be suffering. So they did research on this idea. So there was you mentioned our negativity bias, and part of that as well is that it's kind of related to that, but it's based around, there's another bias called like the identifiable victim effect, which relates to Slovic's research, which is around this idea that, like I mentioned with that Stalin quote around one death is a tragedy, but a million is statistics. There was an essay called "The Nightmare That It Is a Reality" by this guy Arthur Koestler, who in 1944 published this article in the publication formerly known as the New York Times, or the artist formerly known as the New York Times, in 1944, called "The Nightmare That Is a Reality," trying to essentially, like, it was a plea for people to wake up and acknowledge the realities of the Holocaust that was taking place in Europe. And he used the phrase, and that statistics don't bleed. And he was like, well, he's using that as, I'm not by any means comparing the loss of an animal to a person, but he basically said, like, if we see a dog knocked down on the street, that elicits a really horrible emotional reaction. Whereas if we hear about 3 million Polish Jews getting killed, that's just noise that elicits a slight disturbance. Because it's words on a page, or and that's a flaw. As that kind of thing is, like Sam Harris would say, it's like that's a bug, not a fucking beneficial feature of the human condition. That's a bug, like, that we need to be aware of, because it massively distorts. So for someone to see a particular video of George Floyd dying, given the fact that they're expecting, because of the previous bias they've been exposed to, from the narrative they've been exposed to by the CNN and New York Times and NPR and all this, and the critical race theory stuff driven by this postmodern critical theory, critical social justice, supposed academia that is driving this narrative, then that fits their confirmation bias, and it's more information to feed their availability heuristic, plus its negativity bias is being fed because it's a horrible thing to see a fella die on video. But all that resonates because of the underlying narrative, because of the availability heuristic, because of negativity bias, because it confirms an already existent view on reality. That then resonates on a much greater level than hearing that 104 people have been killed in Chicago, or black people have been killed in Chicago over the weekend in gang violence. 104 in one weekend. And that, so like that in itself, and then people, and that inability to go, well, how my view in reality is being distorted enormously by the inherent limitations of the way my brain is set up. But that doesn't mean I can't collect that, like you said, that ability, that point you made around type 1 and type 2 thinking is really important. Because once you realize that, okay, I'm not basing my view of reality on available data, I'm basing my view of reality on anecdotal white swan evidence. Then
Paul Slovic said basically the amount of concern is not adequately sensitive to the probability of harm. That was a Paul Slovic quote as well in his research. Yeah, because it's just distorted. You overweight the information you have.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, like, so then it comes down to, well, if I was to kind of leave somewhat of a parting note for people, it would be that given the awareness, what we've just discussed around the existence of type 1 thinking, and the fact that what I'm not saying, and I think if I could speak for you, Zerbert, you can correct me, is that we're not saying that, like you actually highlighted in the way that you discussed reading about Breonna Taylor, we're not saying that the emotion people is feeling is not real emotion. We're saying that the reason the emotion is there is as a result of these biases and the exposures to certain pieces of information. But that just because we have a large emotive response doesn't mean that our view of reality is correct. Basically,
I think it's worth noting that me and you, we both have a background in meditating and in studying Stoic philosophy and in grappling with the distinction, the important distinction between the experience of an emotion and this separation of that emotion is not me and what I am in. It's a dichotomy of control, or Irvine's trichotomy of control, where you effectively understand what it is that's within your control, and you say, I am not a slave to the fact I'm outraged. I need to, that's it. Outrage is functioning as some sort of an epistemological virtue for people. It itself is what's true because I'm angry. So now it's justified in whatever I decide. Whatever I decide to do with that anger is now justified because I am angry. And it's like, no, it's useless. The emotion is useless. It's human, but you don't then decide what it is you're going to campaign for or expect of other people or your nation or your government or yourself or the people with whom you live. You don't change those expectations based on emotion. You look at what you do you do what you can to find yourself in accordance with reality. And in as much as going back to what you said, falsifiability is one of the best ways to align yourself with what's true, at least more so than other means. Then you do that work. I'm not saying people shouldn't feel the emotion, because I feel the emotion. I just don't then actually decide that I want this person to die because this is a police officer who's just killed a lady who was literally just asleep. I don't decide, oh, okay, well, yeah, I want him to die now, because I recognize also, okay, well, you know, you're pissed off right now, but think of all the things that led up to that. The boyfriend set off a shot. What is he meant to do in response? Of course, there's going to be like a mini shootout. People are all acting rationally in the situation. It's just that way it is to act rationally in this situation is it results in abhorrent outcomes because the situation itself never should have happened. That's the problem. Don't take the emotion and think it means anything useful. That's the most
brilliant point. Yeah, that how strongly we feel about something isn't. There's nothing that ties the strength of emotion to a reflection of reality. There's nothing that connects those two things. There's this emotive response that is not what a person is. It's just this biochemical and neurological milieu that's taking place. But that's not what a person is. That's not what that person identifies with. It's not what it should be anyway. It's just a situation. It's a neurological and biochemical situation. There's nothing that ties that to an accurate reflection of reality. Do you know, in terms, so that's the first thing. And then as you mentioned, and once we can bear that in mind, and we can go, well, okay, I feel very strongly about this, and I've had a massive emotional reaction elicited as a result of exposure to a particular piece of information or a video or whatever. Then, okay, I am not my emotions. Okay, being aware that the emotion has arisen, but I am not this emotion. And now, how I can counteract the bias that I'm going to have is by trying to find out where I am wrong and not where I am right. And then off the back of that, well, okay, so where might I be wrong? And then that starts, I think, with asking yourself, what do I want to be right? So if you genuinely ask yourself, in this situation, what is it that I actually would prefer to be the case? Because that is a pretty simple way of trying to find out what my bias is. Do you know? And
exactly.
And then start out with that, and then seek evidence to the contrary. And then in that sense, that's kind of like a very simple way of, essentially you could think of it like verifying and falsifying. Verifying is just seeking evidence to support your bias. Falsifying is the attempt to find out where my own ideas are wrong.
Dude, where did you get that from? I got like falsifying and verifying. Did you?
Yeah, I made those up when I was writing about dogmatism and enigmata and this kind of these two different flows off the axiom of the infinite unknown or the axiom of the finite known, and then going off those two different pathways. So this is one last point actually, is I mentioned earlier on the critical social justice ideology, and you mentioned something that's really key to that, which is this idea that how someone feels gives them a kind of a sense of a moral righteousness. And that in itself is, this might sound absolutely bananas to people who've never encountered any of this postmodern critical theory stuff, but there's this actual viewpoint at the base of this ideology, this critical social justice ideology. And we might put a link into an article called Naming the Enemy, written by James Lindsay, about critical social justice, because that's the name he's given to it, which I think suits, which is basically, because it's not social justice like that, which could be a good thing, or it could be social justice warrior, woke madness. But it's critical social justice is a particular thing, which is this movement, let's say, that's driven, that has its roots in really toxic views of reality grounded in postmodernism and critical theory, which are essentially based around the idea that there aren't claims to objective reality, and that things like epistemological equity are fine, and that there's all these different ways of knowing things, and that there's like this moral cultural relativism, and that this tribe's claim to understanding about the way the universe works is just as viable and just as equitable as general relativity.
Yeah, it's a Western superiority, like it's a Western supremacist view to think that your understanding of the sun is better than the Mayans' understanding of the sun.
And in that sense, there's obviously, and this stuff all has roots in like anti-colonialism and the horrors that Western civilization, deconstructionism. And this stuff sounds so bananas, but if people want to have a feel for where this stuff is coming from, just look up James Lindsay or Helen Pluckrose And they have a new book that I haven't read yet, but I'm sure it's brilliant, because anything they've ever written or produced has been brilliant that I've encountered or been part of interviews with. But so that's also, so this is why. So like the view, the epistemological underpinnings based on knowledge and claims to knowledge of Western liberal democratic society grounded in science, reason, and freedom is individual freedom and reason is fundamentally antithetical and opposite to the claims to knowledge by this critical social justice stuff that's grounded in epistemological equity instead of science, phallogocentric behavior where it puts things like the logic and reason as it places things like logic and reason on this, as if it talks about them as if they're like tools of the white male patriarchal oppressive tyranny. And then instead of looking at individual freedom, it looks at collective identity. So like the fundamental epistemic underpinnings that lead to knowledge generation are totally antithetical to Western civilization and Enlightenment values, which is why it's so toxic, because it's like undoing the Enlightenment project is what it's attempting to do, even if people who are participating in it don't realize that's what's going on.
Yeah,
you know. Because it's unreasonable anti-reason. It's anti-science, which is evidenced in the hashtag shutdown STEM shit that went on in June. And the fact that there's people that simultaneously claim, actually this is a prime example of these absurd claims to knowledge, that they're totally happy to come out with totally contradictory claims, such as both gender and sex are social constructs, except when talking about trans people who are said to be born as such. It's like, boom, what are we doing here? Like, that's a fundamentally, and that's a totally, that claim doesn't even make sense in its own. Like, that claim isn't even wrong. No, it's like, to use that quote, I can't remember where it came from. That's not even wrong. Like,
yeah, so, it was a physicist.
Yeah.
Bohr, was it? Yeah, it might have been.
Yeah. So, anyway, so that's why this stuff is so mind-boggling.
Niels Bohr.
Because it's not this critical social justice stuff, it's not grounded in reason, it's not grounded in logic, it's not grounded in science, it's not grounded in claims to objective reality other than lived experience of the individual, which is why they have this rhetoric around people being able to take offense to something regardless of whether or not someone meant to be offensive. That's why they have like trigger warnings and safe spaces in universities that have adults in them that are old enough to be able to go off to war if they want, and then buy guns and drive cars, but then they have safe places with stuff where people can go if they're offended. And so like this is why, because the ideology is totally denigrates objective reality in favor of subjective lived experience above all else, which is why it focuses on, and then that's part of this focus on this interlocking victim group way of viewing the world. So that's kind of like
I don't know what's wrong with us, because just as we start finishing up, we start diving into we do this every time.
Yeah, I know.
We finish up like 10 minutes ago, and then we go into like a whole new conversation that I'm interested in as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Maybe we could focus on something like that for our next chat. But I think we covered on precisely what it was we wanted to discuss. And
I'm glad.
I don't have anything else to add. Do you have any parting points or notes or anything to?
No, dude. This was the conversation I wanted to have. If a bit contracted, because like I say, we could do another hour, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we finish on a cliffhanger, so.
Yeah, we need a sign off. Come up with a sign off quickly.
Oh, love everyone and tell the truth. Ram Dass said that.
As eyes burn down, Detroit versus Lately it seems as if it's me against the world.